Hello and welcome to a special edition of Decision NYC from Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, executive editor of Gotham Gazette, and your host. We are just days away from primary election day number 2 of 2022 here in New York. In June, we had party primary elections for statewide and assembly seats, and now we are on to state senate and congressional seats. The bifurcated primary is the result of several key developments, including a court order bumping this set of primaries from June to August, a decision based on a messy redistricting process that did ultimately lead to new district lines for legislative seats across the state, both for the state legislature and the U.S. House of Representatives, part of a once-a-decade process after the latest census. So here we are, primary number 2, with quite a few competitive, interesting, and important races upon us in these contests for party nominations for state senate and U.S. House of Representatives. In just a moment, I'll be joined by 2 expert guests to help me preview this August primary, what's at stake, key races to watch, and a number of key themes. As usual, most of the primary action in New York City is on the Democratic side of the ledger, given the party's immense voter registration advantage in the 5 boroughs. There are a number of crowded and contentious Democratic primaries under the new state Senate and House lines. There are some Republican primaries as well. The winners will advance to the fall general election. Once we get to the general election, much of the focus will be outside of the city in swing districts where there are more Republicans and independent voters competing with those Democrats. And New York districts will be key in the larger picture of which party controls the House of Representatives in Congress come January. But as we approach primary day, August 23rd, there's a lot for us to discuss and for you to be aware of, especially if you are an eligible registered voter. Early voting is already underway, as is absentee voting. This is expected to be a low turnout primary, but you and your friends and relatives and networks can help change that as long as you're ready to vote, and we're here to help you. To see where you're voting, visit the poll site locator website from the New York City Board of Elections. To see your new district lines, you can visit the Redistricting in You New York interactive website from the CUNY mapping service. Joining me today are 2 brilliant people that I love talking politics with. Dr. Christina Greer is a political science professor at Fordham University, the co-host of the podcast FAQ NYC, and the author of Black Ethnics. Sally Goldenberg is a longtime New York City journalist who is the City Hall bureau chief for Politico New York. Hello, Christina and Sally. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Sally.
Hi, good morning.
So there are 2 marquee primaries that most Democratic voters in Manhattan and many in Brooklyn are eligible to vote in, one or the other, the 12th Congressional District and the 10th Congressional District. But there are many other party primary elections, mostly on the Democratic side, as I said, throughout the city, both for state Senate and the House. Very briefly, since we'll be talking a good bit about these 2 primaries, New York's new 10th Congressional District has no incumbent running, a rarity. The district covers a large swath of lower Manhattan, the East and West Villages, the Lower East Side, Chinatown, Tribeca, Battery Park City, the Financial District, and more. And it goes into a big stretch of Brooklyn, including parts of downtown Brooklyn, Gowanus, Park Slope, Sunset Park, Red Hook, Borough Park, and more. In the running in the 10th District are City Council member Carlina Rivera, Assembly members Joanne Simon and Yuli New, former Trump impeachment counsel Dan Goldman, former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, and current Congressman Mondaire Jones, who represents the 17th Congressional District in the Hudson Valley. But given some of the fallout from redistricting, he moved to Brooklyn and he's running in the 10th District. There are other candidates on the ballot as well, but those are the top 6 under a number of metrics. Former Mayor Bill de Blasio's name will be on the ballot, but he dropped out of the race. Then there's the new 12th Congressional District, which covers much of the east side of Manhattan and the west side of Manhattan. And the intense Democratic primary there includes 3 major candidates, including 2 longtime members of Congress, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney and Congressman Jerry Nadler. And then there's also attorney Serge Patel. Because of redistricting, the new map drew both of their bases into this new 12th Congressional District. Representatives Maloney and Nadler are in this race against each other. They were both first elected to Congress in 1992, and only one of them potentially will remain. But Serge Patel is hoping they both will no longer be in Congress. And there is also a 4th candidate on the ballot, Ashmi Seth, who has not garnered a lot of attention in that race. All right, so Christina, Sally, thanks for being here. We'll get to those two districts in a moment. But broadly speaking, let me ask each of you just a couple of big picture items that you're watching here in this August primary that will be concluding in the next few days, although with absentee voting and tight margins, there could always be a few races that linger on for a while. But Christina, what are a couple of big things that you're thinking about as we approach this second primary day of the summer here in New York?
Yeah, well, first of all, Ben, that was a fantastic layout of where we are right now. I mean, per usual, my big thing is turnout, turnout, turnout. We've never had in recent memory an August primary. And so many voters aren't even accustomed to this time period. So we know that it's difficult to get New Yorkers to participate in elections, period, even general elections, but especially primary elections. So we saw pretty embarrassing and abysmal turnout in June. When we've had primaries in September, it's been pretty low turnout. I really fear that August is going to be super low. One, so many people don't even know races are really going on. Sort of a few competitive races that you've laid out and a few others, but a lot of folks don't have any races, competitive races in their particular districts. So it's not like we're having social networks talk about these elections. Two, so many families use August as the sort of last days of summer to leave the city. So unless you did some pre-planning and received an absentee ballot and filled that out, there are going to be lots of folks who maybe hear about a race while they're either on the way to vacation or getting folks, the kids ready for school, and voting in, for their state senator or their member of the House isn't going to be a top priority. And so those are the types of things that really worry me, because we know that state senators control so much of the New York State budget. We're talking billions upon billions of dollars. And then obviously we need so many diligent workers in Washington, D.C. as we see more tension and mania from certain Republicans in our nation's capital.
Sally, how about you? A couple of big things you're looking at here.
Sort of similarly to Christina, I'm, looking at, I would say specifically whether turnout is high or higher in some of the typical like high turnout areas. So in the 12th, you have the Upper West Side, which is, I think, the highest turnout area in New York City pretty consistently. And that presumably favors Congressman Nadler's, who's a longtime incumbent there. So I think that, gives him a pretty big edge, just from, sheer number wise. So I'm kind of looking at specifically whether that neighborhood has more enthusiasm in terms of getting people to the polls than the East Side, where I think, as Chrissy mentioned, probably a lot of people are on vacation and just in general aren't, generally like quite as tuned in. And then in the 10th, you have areas like Carroll Gardens, Park Slope, Borough Park. Those are very big turnout areas in the scheme of, of what will likely be a very low turnout election. And so I think we can kind of make some, not predictions, but we can sort of like handicap these races a little bit just based on who those areas, will likely favor.
Yeah, and let's dig into those two races in just a minute. I have to stress again for anybody watching, there are a lot of other races on the ballot. We're not going to get to all of them. I might mention a few towards the end, but there's a number of competitive other House races and many state Senate primaries happening here in these August primaries. So do your homework about specific races that you may be eligible to vote in. We have rundowns at Gotham Gazette of races to watch, and there's lots of information, of course, also at Politico New York and elsewhere. In terms of voters going to the polls here in August, whoever they may be, and this is often going to be the most sort of regular voters, the most locked in people who really pay attention to local politics, hopefully more people than that as we're getting at here with turnout. But Christina, do we have a sense of sort of what's on people's minds here in the city as they're going to cast these ballots? I think in general elections, often, the differences are more clear. In these primaries, you have to really pay very close attention often to see the differences between candidates on a number of issues. But a lot of times it's demographics, it's their connections to the district, maybe it's their stances on specific issues. How are you thinking about sort of what voters are thinking about or should be thinking about as they head to the polls here?
Right. Well, I mean, as Sally laid out, in sections of the 10th district and sections of the 12th, we have very high participation rates in the past. So I would think that those voters are, let's just say in the 12th district, they're saying, well, either Jerry Nadler or Carolyn Maloney, they are in senior positions, they are heads of committees. And so some voters might want that continuity. We saw Jerry Nadler have a national profile in certain judicial committee meetings. And so there are certain voters who might want him to stay where he is, just to make sure, just in case the Democrats maintain the majority, their district would have some sort of senior representation. In District 10, for example, because it is an open seat, we know that it's very difficult to unseat someone once they're an incumbent. And so for, say, a district like where State Senator Alessandra Biaggi is running against Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney, that one's a little more complicated. Some people might want Sean Patrick Maloney because he is in such powerful leadership with the DCCC, but other people might want sort of a younger, fresh face. There's a lot of conversation within the Democratic Party about when are we going to pass these batons? We've got great people who are working in Washington, D.C. and in Albany diligently on behalf of, Democrats everywhere. However, we've got a lot of septuagenarians and octogenarians who are in the leadership. And so when is the best time to either pass the baton, or should we just get some really young, fresh, say millennial, Gen Z leadership just to even start the pipeline?
Any themes you're noticing, Sally, in terms of either specific issues that seem to be coming up more than others across the board, or some of these things like generational change that has been discussed a lot, of course, in the 12th Congressional District race, where Surj Patel is trying to make this argument, to go with a younger, newer, fresher face with some new ideas for the direction of the district and the country against these two longtime incumbents. You hear a lot of discussion of housing policy and climate policy, of course, protecting or re-protecting reproductive rights, comes up a lot. Again, it's often hard to discern some differences. Anything else you're sort of noticing as key themes or advice for voters as to what they should really be paying attention to as they're making their choices here?
Yeah, I'll take that second question first, just because it's an easy one. I think everybody should read the transcripts of the New York Times editorial board interviews and rewatch some of the debates. I know you've also interviewed everybody, and I found those very useful. Those questions, really generated some interesting, compelling answers, I thought, from people, and showed some differences between them. So there's a lot of information out there for people who are interested, in hearing more. I just, the Times endorsed over the weekend, so that was fresh in my mind, and I read all of the transcripts, and I thought they were extremely informative, both in terms of figuring out why the board endorsed who they endorsed, and just kind of getting a better sense of where these people stand on policies. And in terms of things that I think are coming up in the races, there's a section of issues that get discussed a lot that are local. So public housing, funding for public housing, the lack of affordable housing, or just the lack of housing in general in New York, transportation, the quality of the subway system. These are things that aren't really regulated that much in Congress, but they do come up in the discussions. And then I think people are pretty, Democrats are pretty focused on Roe and the overturning of the Supreme Court decision and what Congress will do about that, why the Democrats didn't codify it earlier, and inflation. I think, everybody is thinking about prices, whether they're people who are struggling or wealthier people. The 10th and the 12th are, fairly wealthy districts, but certainly have many neighborhoods where people are economically disadvantaged. And I think on both ends of the economic spectrum, everybody is worried about gas prices, about housing costs, rental costs, purchase prices. Just inflation across the board is something that you hear constantly in these, in these debates and town halls and forums.
Sally, say a little bit more about the 12th Congressional District. Let's just dig in there a little bit more. This battle of the Titans between Representatives Nadler and Maloney, and then you have Surj Patel making his third run for Congress. He challenged Maloney the last two cycles, came fairly close in 2020, but this district is now very different, and you throw Representative Nadler in the mix. So how should we be sort of thinking about what that might come down to? There's obviously, as Chrissy mentioned, the very high turnout, and you mentioned the very high turnout on the West Side. Often the East Side has pretty decent turnout too. What are you thinking about might make or break the difference here? And you mentioned the New York Times editorial board came down in favor recently of Representative Nadler. No surprise there, but that could help cement his standing among a number of voters. What else is this race coming down to, do you think?
As Chrissy mentioned, it is a generational race. You have two people who have about 30 years each in the House. They are different. I think that some of the coverage, kind of puts them in the same bucket because they're both older and incumbents. But, Jerry Nadler is very quick to point out they voted differently on the Patriot Act, on the Iraq War, on the Iran nuclear deal. And so there are some pretty substantial differences. They're both Democrats. They're both, blue Democrats, but he is to the left of Carolyn Maloney on a number of issues. I think there's a lot of discussion in this race about incumbency and age, just given, that is what Serge Patel has made the race about. So he's not really running. I mean, he is running an issues-based campaign in that he talks a lot about issues, but his argument to voters is that it's time, for someone younger, someone more connected to what most Americans are going through. The Times matters a lot. I think the Times endorsement matters a lot, specifically in this district. I think I would have been very surprised if Jerry Nadler didn't get it. He had a couple of weak debate performances, one in particular where he seemed to struggle sort of physically and had, kind of some stumbles verbally. And I thought maybe the Times would take that into account. But, I read the transcripts. He gave a very compelling interview, much more so, I thought, than the other two. And I think that will make a difference. We saw the power of the Times in the mayor's race last year elevate a virtually no-name candidate to an almost winning candidate. They, picked the correct candidate for comptroller. In other words, the winning candidate for comptroller and Manhattan DA. So I think that matters a lot. I think turnout will matter a lot. And I think at a time when Democrats are really concerned about the Republican Party's, what Democrats view as, an assault on the rule of law, I think the incumbency might not be as much of a disadvantage in this particular district as it would be, in maybe 2018 when AOC beat Joe Crowley.
Right. And you do have a lot of voters in this district who are older and who are very comfortable with probably their current representatives, as you said, in a moment like this, and also this, this clout in Congress question and chairing these committees with Nadler judiciary and Maloney oversight and reform. But it's we're seeing some of the tensions within the Democratic Party play out in that race, not only in the difference in politics and voting record of Nadler and Maloney, as you got at, but also this question about, are the Democrats who've been in office a long time fighting hard enough on issues like climate, for example, or housing? And so those are interesting themes coming up. Christina, those are also coming up in the 10th district. Say anything you want about the 12th. I don't want to leave you out of that conversation further, but I also want to move to the 10th in a minute, and how you're sort of seeing the playing field there. I went over the 6 top candidates. This is a crowded race, 6 pretty accomplished candidates in the race. Very hard to sort of, at least for me, put my finger on where this is heading. The New York Times editorial board giving a big boost to Dan Goldman with their endorsement, although in a very high information district, that might not sway as many voters who are paying really close attention to the candidates and have been represented by several of these candidates currently in office in the city council, the assembly. So anything you want to add on the 12th district, and then how are you thinking about the 10th?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Sally's analysis about the 12th. I think the one thing I would add, because I definitely think that not only did Jerry Nadler go in with an advantage, and I think the New York Times endorsement, although expected, is definitely a boon for him. I mean, I think he would have been shocked if he didn't receive it, and I definitely would have been shocked. I think the one policy issue that Sally didn't mention were the vaccinations, and
Yes.
where Nadler and Maloney differ is that she has been slightly less vax ready in the past, and Jerry Nadler's brought that up quite a bit, especially since we're still living in COVID and so many parents are trying to figure out the school year. I think, just as I shift to the 10th, laying out the New York Times endorsement, a lot of folks this past weekend were just, if you read Twitter as the news, saying, how could this newspaper endorse 3 white guys? And I thought it was a little more nuanced than that. I mean, Jerry Nadler versus Carolyn Maloney and Patel. But, honestly, I don't know if I'm going to put Patel as like a real third. It's his third time running. I don't know if he's really laid out the case other than I'm younger than these guys and I have similar policy positions. So Maloney versus Nadler, it sort of makes sense that they went with Nadler. A newspaper like the New York Times, Biaggi versus Sean Patrick Maloney. Again, that makes sense to me. It's a purple district. Biaggi is to the left of Sean Patrick, and he has such leadership in Congress already. That endorsement made sense to me. The 10th is where it gets a little tricky and sticky because the endorsement really did talk about Mondaire Jones, who's a sitting congressman who decided to leave his district, travel an hour and a half south to go to Manhattan and Brooklyn and run in an open seat. Where I don't know why he didn't stay and fight for his own district, because an open seat is never an open seat. We know that everyone and their grandmother is running. Literally everyone and grandmothers are in the race. So we have these 6 main candidates, but we still have other people on the ballot. We've got the Times endorsing Dan Goldman, who is probably, I would say, the greatest novice of the 6 candidates you listed, mentioning Mondaire Jones, who's a sitting congressman, quite a bit, but still not endorsing him. They spoke about Holtzman, who's a former congresswoman from the 70s and the Nixon era. But I thought what was glaring about the endorsement was just no mention of Carlina Rivera or Yulin New, both of whom are sitting electeds, Rivera in the city council and Yulin in Albany. And so that, to me, might galvanize some of their supporters, especially since it sort of the feeling of the district was that Carlina was actually in the 1 or 2 spot, at least in the top 3. So to not even mention her in the endorsement, I thought was pretty powerful. But as you and Sally have mentioned before, how one performs on a debate stage and how we see them campaigning and pressing the flesh and door knocking and doing get out the vote efforts, it's very different when you go into the New York Times endorsement meeting and you're sitting with that board. And that seems like something that might be a little bit more in Dan Goldman's wheelhouse. And so he may have impressed them in that capacity. But I think that was the big shocker. The other 2 endorsements weren't. And so I do think it will galvanize Goldman definitely in that particular district and give him, at least people now know who he is since he's not even elected. But I do think that it could have a reverse effect and galvanize some of the sitting electeds bases who feel, who is this white guy who's a millionaire who's thus far given himself $2 million to run in this race? It might actually work against him. And the New York Times, isn't batting 100 when it comes to their endorsements. It seems as though they endorse people that they like, but it's sometimes very off the mark when it comes to more specific races where they're not really reading the room and the zeitgeist of the particular district and what people need.
Jump in there, Sally, on 10. Yeah.
I can't say I was totally surprised because Dan Goldman does seem like somebody who is of the elite world that I would imagine some people high up in the New York Times are of. I think it was surprising that they chose to do 3 white men at a time when gender and race are in the, kind of a constant discussion nationally for good reason, and gender in particular in this cycle because of Roe. But I sort of always thought Goldman had probably a decent shot just because I figured he had some connections to some people there. He did do well in the interview. But I was going to say that I think, to Chrissy's point, I think the left is going to sort of have to decide whether they want to get behind one candidate or sort of continue to fracture themselves as they've done in a number of recent races, the mayor's race last year being one. I think at this moment, if the left decided, let's all get behind either Carlina Rivera, Mondaire Jones, or Yulin New, that person probably has a decent shot. Goldman's voters, I would imagine, will be away. There are parts of the district where it's probably less likely that people are going to be on, fancy vacations at the end of August. And those are areas like Red Hook, Sunset Park. I mean, everyone can take vacation, but I think you might see more people in town during, in those areas. And I think those are areas that would go strong for someone other than Dan Goldman. And the other thing I thought was good for him, in terms of voters, is after the Times came out, Orthodox Jewish leaders in Borough Park who do vote as a bloc put out, I don't know if it was an endorsement, but put out a missive to their community to get behind Dan Goldman and to absolutely not vote for Yulin New, given her positions on issues they care about related to Israel. And so, that could be, I don't know how many votes they have right now in this district because it was changed a few times, but they do have a block of votes in the district that could help him. But I totally agree with Chrissy. I think there could be a backlash to the Times, and I think it's kind of incumbent on progressives, if they don't want to see Dan Goldman in Congress, to get behind one of these other candidates.
And Ben, can I just add something
please.
really quickly? Some of the data has also shown that really wealthy New Yorkers just don't vote. Not only do they not vote in general elections, they just don't vote at all. And in some ways, their psychology is that they're kind of immune to any of the exogenous shocks that we are not immune to. And so we saw this a little bit with Ray McGuire in the mayor's race, where there was an assumption that sort of wealthy New Yorkers would get behind him. And not only did wealthy New Yorkers not get behind him, they just didn't bother to turn out to vote. We've seen this time and time again when you ask sort of people of a particular price point if they've participated in primaries, general elections, municipal elections, presidential elections, mid-year elections. They just don't bother to turn out. And that could actually spell trouble for Dan Goldman, not just because folks aren't even in New York and probably haven't filled an absentee ballot, but they aren't accustomed to voting at all.
I will say, for these top 6 candidates in the 10th Congressional District primary, you can sort of map out each of them having a strong base. They have certain forces behind them, whether it's the Working Families Party for Yulene New, or it's 1199 SEIU for Carlina Rivera, as well as she, I think, is leading the field in significant endorsements by quite a bit with elected officials and others. But Joanne Simon has this very high voter turnout base in the district for her assembly district. Obviously, Liz Holtzman has strong name recognition. Mondaire Jones has quite a few national groups who've gotten behind him, and he's got some money that he's putting into the race. So there's really interesting dynamics in that race that make it very, very hard to know where it's heading. And as you're both getting at, absentee votes will matter a lot. Who actually applied for those ballots? Who's actually going to send them back? It's going to be very interesting. Christina Greer, one more thought on something before we have to say goodbye.
As someone who wakes up and reads the Gotham Gazette and Politico before I even get out of bed, both Gotham Gazette and Politico have both talked about how this race might be decided with absentee ballots. And so I really do hope that it's done in a timely and organized fashion so we don't further erode voters' confidence in actually bothering to participate.
Great point. Sally Goldenberg, one more thought.
One of the many state Senate races I'm looking at is Andrew Grinardis. He's an incumbent. He's being challenged by David Yaskey, who had served in the city council and was the chair of the Taxi Limousine Commission, also worked for Andrew Cuomo, and has a pretty long history in the district. I think David Yaskey has name recognition in probably a higher turnout part of the district, but Andrew Grinardis is in office and has really made a name for himself in office.
30 seconds here to also say, in the Bronx, State Senator Gustavo Rivera is facing a very serious Democratic primary challenge. In Manhattan, State Senator Robert Jackson is facing a very serious and competitive primary challenge. And in Brooklyn, State Senator Kevin Parker is facing a very serious and competitive primary challenge. That's just 3 more to throw out there for folks to look into. But like I said, check out where you're voting and what might be on your ballot. Dr. Christina Greer is a political science professor at Fordham University, co-host of FAQ NYC, the New York City podcast, and the author of Black Ethnics. Sally Goldenberg is the City Hall Bureau Chief for Political New York. Thank you both for being here. And I'm Ben Max, editor of Gotham Gazette. Thank you very much for watching Manhattan Neighborhood Network's Decision NYC. Be ready to vote if you're eligible in the August 23rd primary, and then, of course, coming up in the general election. Thanks for watching.